Hello, everyone, and welcome to the webcast. My name is Christine Dursey. I'm the Executive Director of APA Ohio and Vice Chair of the Neurourbanism Division, and I will be your moderator for today's webcast. There we go. Okay. Today, Friday, February 21st, I think, we will hear the presentation, Ferries, an Integral Part of Public Transit. For technical help during today's webcast, type your questions in the chat box found in the webcast toolbar to the right of your screen, or call the 1-800 number shown. For content questions related to the presentation, type those in the questions box also located in the webinar toolbar to the right of your screen. We will answer those at the end of the presentation during the Q&A. On your screen is a list of the sponsoring chapters and divisions. I'd like to thank all those participating sponsors for making these webcasts free and possible. Today's webcast is sponsored by the Transportation Planning Division. For more information on our chapters, visit planning.org/chapters. For more information about our divisions, visit planning.org/divisions. And we'll hear from Gabriella of the Transportation Planning Division in just a moment. On your screen is a list of upcoming webcasts. To register for these webcasts, please visit utah-apa.org/webcasts. To log your CM credits for attending today's webcast, visit planning.org/CM, select today's date and today's webcast. This webcast has been approved for 1.5 CM credits for live viewing only. Some recorded webcasts are available for distance education CM credit. For availability of CM credit, check the webcast webpage at utah-apa.org/webcasts. Of course, like us on Facebook, Planning Webcast Series, to receive up-to-date information on upcoming sessions. We are recording today's webcast, and it will be available on our YouTube channel. Just search Planning Webcast on YouTube. A PDF of the PowerPoint will also be available at ohioplanning.org/webcast presentations. Okay, I'd now like to turn it over quickly to Gabriella of the Transportation Planning Division to speak a few moments about the division, and then we'll get started. Gabriella.
Hello, everyone. I wanted to say good morning to our West Coasters. That would be everyone that lives near me. And good afternoon to all you snowed-in folks that are such troopers to make this still happen despite your unsunny weather. But I wanted to also thank our wonderful panelists. We're so excited to have this great topic that never gets enough attention in transportation planning. And so we're just really lucky to have these amazing experts to help bring the full spectrum of what we do in transportation planning to you through our transportation division. And I highly, highly, highly recommend you to join our division and also to tell me about something awesome about your job so we can make it a webinar too, because everyone does really awesome things in transportation planning, and we should just share it among ourselves to make ourselves much better planners. And I'm really excited about our upcoming Transportation and Women in Planning Division co-sponsored webinar on March 3rd on gender issues in public transportation. So if you all are available and willing, you're going to have a wonderful hour and a half of great information just like today. So please, please, please contact me with great webinar ideas and we will make it happen. With that, I will turn it over and we will get on to the show today. Have a great webinar, folks. Thanks.
Thank you, Gabriella. Next, I'm just going to introduce our three speakers, and then we have some polls for you, and then we'll get started. So our first speaker today is Noelle Como. Noelle is a senior transportation planner with over 15 years of experience in marine transportation, freight, and urban planning, currently supporting the Office of Gateways in the Maritime Administration's Office of Intermodal System Development. Previously, he detailed to the Committee for the Marine Transportation System Executive Secretariat to lead development of the Assessment of the Marine Transportation System report to Congress. He brings a wide array of project experience from his last 2 assignments as a contracting officer's representative for the Port of Guam redevelopment project and from the America's Marine Highway Program. He's also a project manager and certified urban planner. Before joining the Maritime Administration in late 2008, Mr. Como consulted with the U.S. Navy and Coast Guard. For Commander Navy Installations Command, he oversaw the physical security waiver and exception process, providing subject matter expertise to a physical security exercises at NS Norfolk, and briefed all CONUS Navy facility security officers. For the U.S. Coast Guard, Noel addressed maritime transportation resiliency and security issues of the marine transportation system under HSPD 13, including special event security policy. Prior to the U.S. Navy and Coast Guard, Noel worked for a number of years on various MTS-related projects. Noel has a Master's of Urban and Regional Planning from the University of New Orleans, during which time he interned in the Port of New Orleans Planning Department. And he has a Bachelor of Arts from Tulane University. He is past chair of APA's Transportation Planning Division and past co-chair of the APA Division Council Chapter President's Council Joint Task Force. Tim Payne is our second speaker. Tim, a principal with Nelson Nygaard Consulting Associates, is co-lead of the firm's transit practice and has over 35 years' experience in the transit disciplines. Tim is one of the few professionals in the industry with significant transit and ferry operations experience. Tim worked the first quarter of his career with Washington State Ferries, the next 22 years with the Pierce Transit, and the past 6 years as a consultant. Tim's passion is building livable, sustainable communities. Walking, biking, and transit are foundational elements that will allow us to inhabit great communities and enjoy the benefits of economic vitality. Our final speaker today is Hannah Henn. Hannah currently serves as Assistant Vice President and Director of Ferries in New York City Economic Development Corporation's Ports and Transportation Group. Her responsibilities include procurement, management, and oversight of the East River Ferry, serving 1.2 million passengers in 2013, and the Rockaway commuter ferry service put in place after Hurricane Sandy damaged subway infrastructure. Recent policy publications and initiatives include a citywide ferry study, which was released as a preliminary report in December 2013, and Ferry Policy and Planning in New York City, a white paper on ferry lessons learned and service considerations in the New York Harbor. Previously, Hannah performed structural bridge design work in Philadelphia and acted as a construction manager for large-scale adaptive reuse urban projects in Providence, Rhode Island. Hannah continued her engineering and construction work for Metropolitan Transportation Authority's Bridges and Tunnels Group in New York City before returning to graduate school to pursue her interest in policy. Hannah's interest in transportation policy and planning stems from her childhood experience living across Southeast Asia and travel to nearly 50 countries. She holds a bachelor's degree in structural civil engineering from Brown University and a Master of Public Administration and Urban Policy from Columbia University. So with that, let's go ahead and open up the polls to kind of help our speakers gauge the folks that we have on today. So I'm going to go ahead and open up the first one. If you could go ahead and select that, your response. Great. All right, so the first question is, how many people on the call take a ferry to work? And it appears that 99% of us do not take the ferry to work. So with that, speakers, I'm going to go ahead and close this one now, and then we'll go on to the next one. And our next question is going to be put up on the screen. And the next question is, if you do take a ferry, is it a seasonal ferry? And it looks like of those that do take a ferry, it looks like 3% of them say no, that it is not a seasonal ferry. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and close that one. We'll go to our next one. And for those few that do utilize the ferry, if you could just tell us how you access it. And it looks like the majority of folks, 50% drive, 29% walk, 14% bus rail. Great. I'm going to go ahead and close that one. Two more here. Okay, so for the majority of us, would you like to take a ferry to work if there was one available? I'll leave this one up for just a few moments just to make sure that folks have a chance to answer. Okay, it looks like 55% of us says, yes, we would like to take a ferry to work, and 44% say, no, that's okay. Okay, I'm going to close this one, and then our final question is, what best describes your predominant mode for your work trip? I'll give this one a second. Okay, so it looks like 70% of us, we drive, taxi, carpool, 16% bus rail, 7% walk, bicycle, 6% telecommute, and then the remaining 1% take a ferry. Okay, great. So that's it. So I would say, all in all, most of our folks drive and carpool, and half of us would like to take a ferry if we had the choice. So thanks for polling, everybody. I'm going to go ahead and turn the screen over now to our first speaker, which is Noel. Noel, it's all you.
Thank you very much, Christine. This is Noel Como. I assume everybody can see my screen where you see the beginning with the Ferry Committee. As Christine described, I'm former chair of the Transportation Division, but I'm also incoming chair for the APO 85 Ferry Committee for the Transportation Research Board, besides currently being employed by the Maritime Administration. However, today I'm going to focus on the Ferry Committee. Quick point before I move on is that some of you may not know there was a Ferry Committee. There's a concept within the Maritime Administration called Marine Highways, which mostly focuses on freight, but there is some work they do with ferries. So that kind of got to be my interest when I was formally supporting that office and that effort, and Tim Jackson will go into that later on. But more importantly is that TRB has been exploring this concept for quite a while through the Ferry Committee, including the synthesis effort or research effort that Tim will also cover in a few minutes. So for now, I'm just going to cover the overall committee. As you can see, I'm going to briefly mention what is a ferry by legal terms, talk about the Ferry Committee itself, which is my goal today, potential research topics, which of course is the goal of TRB, federal resources involved in that, and then next steps, and then the TRB CMTS, which is the Committee for the Marine Transportation System that Christine mentioned, a joint conference that's coming up that proves to be very interesting. So without further ado, what is a ferry? Some of you may recognize this particular ferry from the Boston service to Hingham Shipyard. In having attended that national conference a few years ago, I took that particular excursion and found it extremely interesting. First off, because it's a ferry service involved. Second off, because it was reutilization of essentially a brownfield site or a former industrial site, making smaller naval vessels in World War II, now a mixed-use development of retail and residential. A ferry is actually defined in the U.S. Code as by 46 U.S.C. Section 2102(10)B, and it normally runs between set points and on set schedules. Now, this may seem very basic, but it's kind of important. We have services out there that you may know. You see ferry on them. including in New York City, you might see the term water taxi, or in the Washington, D.C. area the same. So a water taxi, in contrast, is a little different. It's typically, most commonly, a smaller passenger vessel that can be used as a ferry, but you really don't see water taxi defined in U.S. code. Typically, they're not larger routes, and they're really usually run those quick services that are not economical. As we all know, taxis tend to be more on-demand services. Ferries tend to be more set schedules. As you all saw from the polls, we have only about 1% of the people attending today that are currently utilizing ferries. And then in contrast to that, for those who said they would take a ferry if available, of that number, people who, the 99% who don't, roughly 55% said they would. One way to think of it is that ferries, being on the water, is a great way to go to work because it's much more relaxing instead of dealing with transit, being on your feet, etc. And then, of course, boat fault. So without further ado, the committee itself, its intent is to foster and distribute useful information, to conduct research, which we'll go into in a few minutes. The audience can include operators, can include manufacturers and users, which is important in terms of discussing what is the kind of research that the committee does or should do or should be pointing towards, as I mentioned, that Tim will cover. The research types of ideas, which is part of the goal today, to get you thinking, if anybody has any ideas, because it's not always just about integrating them into existing transit services. It's not always just about emergency services. So it can include, management, design, construction, the type of vessel, the operations. So to find more information, you can Google it, look for TRB for the committees and panels, and you can find the APO 85 TRB Ferry Committee. The membership is currently being updated, which I'll cover shortly. There is a Google site and then a LinkedIn site coming soon. As I mentioned, in terms of covering the committee's composition, this is the composition moving ahead from today forward. Roughly about 5% of the membership is people related or working for ports. In contrast, you have on the bottom side the local and regional government representing about 14%, and the same goes for the state government. On the larger side, you see nonprofit organizations, as it's generally described, which mostly includes research efforts or academic entities, which is important for the committee, being as much as 30%. And then 19% operators, which is extremely important. So the committee isn't just about people free-thinking, so to speak. It's also about really grounding the research and what's useful. And then finally, about 20% federal government, including from the Federal Transit Administration or the formerly known Research and Technology Administration for DOT, now becoming part of the Office of the Secretary of Transportation. So some of those research ideas, and you can put them under impediments or solutions, meaning that you might have an issue, and then fuel access, is that something that needs to be addressed for ferries? Believe it or not, it's that important. If some people are familiar in the Great Lakes with the Badger is considering alternative fuels. Well, then you get into the infrastructure necessary to support that operation. Navigation, is it a no-wake zone? A lot of times you see no-wake zones because you have recreational marinas nearby. The no-wake zone is created to protect the private operators, and unfortunately you have some politics in there in some cases, being who owns the boats in the marina. Transit connections, which is one of my favorites, is so important because you can't just have that service. As I recall, about 50% of people currently drive to work, 70% currently drive, 50% access ferries for the 1% who are using ferries. And the idea as we move forward with smarter living is either developments that are next to the ferries we see in the New York metropolitan area, or a way to get to that ferry service that is not utilizing your personal vehicle, not just by carpooling, but using transit. And that goes even here in the Washington, D.C. area. So the same goes for competing modes. Dredging is important. We see that that's starting to be an issue here. And then funding, of course, what does it cost? Further, a few other ideas. You have the shoreline in terms of the land use that's there. What makes sense? Who needs to cooperate? the current predominant development pattern. Again, is it retail? Is it mixed land use? Is it being built intentionally for that service, or is the service being brought in with the land use development? And then bridge costs in contrast when you get into competing modes. What we see here in the D.C. area is the Virginia Railway Express being a commuter train. Is the same exists for the Hingham Shipyard operation. And it's competing in the sense that it's at capacity, which is an issue. Metro is also getting to be at capacity here in the D.C. area. So is ferry a better option? Again, that be a potential research idea. So moving ahead, as I was mentioning with D.C., the most recent published urban mobility report from Texas A&M and TTI is that Washington, D.C. now proudly ranks #1 in congestion. And being a resident here, I can speak to that very well, unfortunately. Walkability. Is ferry a better solution? Again, is it next to the retail development, or is it that far away? Alternative fuels. LNG is the current predominant focus of alternative fuels in marine vessels. A couple of years ago, it was low sulfur and ultra low sulfur diesel. EPA with their program in terms of converting diesel to lower sulfur diesel vessels and engine power plants. Now it's getting to be LNG. And the question is, where will we see that in ferries where we produce less emissions? Transit-oriented development, well, that term also applies to ferries. Now, some of you may know that federal employees are eligible for commuter benefits. That is not just in the Washington, D.C. area, but our Gateway Office Director in Seattle, Washington utilizes his benefits because they can be applied, if you look at the legislation, to ferry services. And the current amount was changed to $130 this year, by the way. Emergency evacuation, we've seen that, many of you might know from the Loma Prieta earthquake. That was important, and as well as, of course, in New York City, out of Manhattan. The picture you see here is National Harbor. National Harbor is a development right outside Washington, D.C., or the District of Columbia. It's in Maryland, near the Woodrow Wilson Bridge. It has completely taken off, being operated or owned, better said, by Peterson Development Corporation. It is truly a nice development. It is not, it runs its own shuttle, but the only other really transit service that's operating in a few buses, to get across the river, you take a taxi or shuttle, water shuttle I should say, from Old Town Alexandria. I've done it myself. It's a great service. It's a great way for people to get there. And the operator of that service has mentioned that he gets some of his customer base now from the Ronald Reagan Airport because they're coming down here, long story short, with their bags. They're seeing them catch their ferry over to National Harbor in the Maryland side of the Washington, D.C. area. So federal support in terms of ferry, it's not just, which is the same, kind of goes for TRB. The question is it a transit issue or is it a water or maritime issue? Well, in terms of federal support, it comes in different ways. The Maritime Administration has the America's Marine Highway Program. Then on top of that, the Gateway Office Program, which is sort of like the Federal Highway Regional Offices. The Gateway Office directors support various ferry services, including in New York City and including in New Orleans, with some of the changes that just are happening in the last week and the operations of the ferry across the Mississippi River from Algiers to downtown New Orleans. The Federal Highway Administration, the former discretionary ferry grant program, was changed to a formulary program by MAP 21, which also created a discretionary ferry grant program under the Federal Transit Administration. That deadline has passed, and those grant requests or applications are being reviewed now. But also other support comes through the U.S. Coast Guard from the permanent vessel certification point of view, channel buoy maintenance, and NOAA for navigation charts. As I mentioned, the two programs that changed, quick point of fact, Federal Transit Administration, the notice of funding availability closed in the fall, October 21st. Those are currently being reviewed, and for your information, the program manager is Vanessa Williams, and as you can see the number without calling it out specifically, she'd be contacted, and at the end, when we provide our contact information, just feel free to give me a shout and let me know what you need, and I can also point you to Vanessa if you need to. Departmental support with some of the programs I mentioned in the Maritime Administration, myself, but also Seneca SOC at the number you can see, Joe Taylor with the Federal Highway Administration for the formulary program, and FTA, Vanessa Williams regarding, as I saw on the last slide, the discretionary program. But the two people you see here, Jeff Spencer and Charlie Wilder, are great points of contact. They both understand water services besides just urban transit. The next meeting for the TRB Ferry Committee is going to be Monday, June 23rd at 5:30 at the National Academy of Sciences, and I'll explain that more in a second. Our next steps, which we're going to start moving forward on as I come in as the incoming chair and take over from the outgoing chair, Roberta Weisbrod, as some of you may know, is to develop a short strategic plan which helps us determine the research needs. So we keep an eye out for additional committee members as we're finishing the composition of the committee for 2014 to 17. And even if you're not a member, we also, as many of you know with TRB, have friends of the committee, and we really welcome your participation. Excuse me. So in concluding the last couple of slides, focusing on, as you saw from the last slide, the June 23rd meeting, that there's an upcoming TRB, this is the summer meeting essentially, with the Committee for the Marine Transportation System, a joint conference entitled Innovative Technologies for Resilient Marine Transportation System. Now, this will include freight, but that's why we're also tagging on to their meeting, if you will, on the night before. Makes complete sense. In terms of the conference itself, we'll be focusing on assessing the state of the MTS, or the Marine Transportation System, addressing quantitative and qualitative performance. One term they use, if you jump down to the last bullet, for example, is e-navigation, which is kind of like ITS for the water. The Corps of Engineers has been working on that with the CMTS in the current strategy as well as assessment of the MTS report to Congress that's being completed at this time. As I mentioned, with the upcoming conference, the deadline is coming up quick, but I really think this is a great idea for people to attend if you're near or can attend in the Washington, D.C. area. They're doing a call for papers. You can find this information from cmts.gov or just give me a shout either by phone or email. And then finally, here's my contact information, but it'll also be displayed at the end of everybody speaking with Christine. So that being said, thank you for listening.
Good afternoon, good morning, whichever time zone you happen to be in. This is Tim Payne of Nelson Nygaard Consulting Associates. I'm happy to have the opportunity to present to you today. And my topic today is really going to be talking about how do we make ferry systems more integral to our transportation system and our transit systems. And the centerpiece of the presentation today will be based off of a transportation cooperative research report synthesis that I was the principal investigator for, that was actually published about a year ago now, integrating passenger ferry service with mass transit. This was a survey of current practice that we actually did all the survey work and then summarized the survey and put it together, and that's what today's presentation is drawn from. So just really quickly, we talked to 60 different organizations that are either ferry operators or land-based operators or both, about how the ferry and the land-based transit, and that could be either bus or rail, by the way, interact with each other. I think one of the conclusions that we drew is that there are very, very few interfaces, and an interface just means a place where land and water come together, by the way, a singular location where land and water come together. So each interface is unique. There are several instances where there are ferry routes that are on one end, they're met by one transit agency. On another end, they're met by another transit agency, and in some cases, there's even multiple transit agencies on both ends trying to coordinate with a singular ferry. The other thing that we really uncovered, and you'll see a little bit more as we go on in the presentation, is that ferry terminals connect very different scales of communities and land uses throughout the U.S. This is a map of the distribution of the agencies that responded to the survey, and as you can see, they're pretty much on either coast, with one on the Gulf Coast as well. That wasn't from lack of trying to find others to respond, but these are the ones that are represented inside the survey. So just quickly, this is a rundown of the types of communities that we found. Predominantly, if you add them together, small villages on one end and large, denser metropolitan areas on the other end. If I was going to characterize ferry operations in the United States today, I'd say that really probably is the predominant character. It's collecting and coming to larger urban settings. This has to do with the intensity of the interchange between land-based and ferries. And again, this is strictly out of the survey. And this is in passengers per day, by the way. And you can see that there's a relatively small number that are extraordinarily intense. That means more than 1,000 passengers a day. Many more are characterized by low to moderate intensity. What we found is this intensity, the degree of intensity, plays a major role in how well coordinated that ferries and land-based transit are, and why. So why integrate? Why would a land-based and a water system-based transit system look at integrating their services? What are the driving and motivating factors? From the survey, what we uncovered was that the islands, or very remote locations that are very nearly islands, the ferry dock is a good ridership market. It's a point market where you have a lot of people arriving who are going to different places. So it's sort of equivalent to a large employer that is active all day long, if you will. The sheer volume of transferring passengers demands attention. Simply that the number of people that are transferring between modes is so large that it's not possible for either the ferry or for the local transit operator to just say, well, we'll just let it happen however it happens. The number of people in and of itself focuses the need for attention on integrating land and water. Another motivating factor that we uncovered is that occasionally systems are designed where both the land-based and the water-based part of the system are done simultaneously. And that is that in the initial development of the service, and this often happens in terms of setting up a new system to substantially substitute for or to supplement an existing transportation system, and this could be a bridge, could be rail, could be any number of things, that they're set up as an integrated system from day one. And then finally, that coordination could also be the result of local or regional transportation demand management services or congestion management strategies. So we'll find often that systems that were once upon a time separated have now become integrated because of efforts to utilize that resource more effectively in terms of managing transportation demand. One of the things that we uncovered in this research was that the degree of coordination is very heavily linked to the frequency of ferry and or transit service. Very high frequencies of ferry or transit service are generally coincide with a decreased need to coordinate, or that coordination is isolated to one singular type of coordination, and we'll talk about that a little bit more, what some of those types are. Lower frequencies of service are far more common in terms of integrating ferry and land-based services, and oftentimes require more creative solutions like matching headways, facilitating operational communications, and integrating the facilities themselves. So we're going to talk about each one of those now as we go ahead. Speaking of Boston, this is a shot of downtown Boston Harbor. So one of the things that we uncovered, again, we asked what types of coordination were going on with respect to the service itself. We're going to talk about service, we're going to talk about fares, and we're going to talk about facilities and information as we go along here today. There are about half of the reported interfaces, and again, just for lack of, to remind you all, an interface is simply a point where land and water meet. So in a place like the Puget Sound region, if we counted up, there I don't remember how many there are, but there are over 30 interface points within the Puget Sound region itself. So this doesn't mean a system, it means a singular point. So about half of the points reported, there was no form of service coordination at all. These tend to be either very, very small markets where a ferry would land and maybe one or two people would walk off the ferry, or vice versa on the land side. There's very low demand or maybe no transit demand at all. Or we find the other end of the spectrum where we have very high frequency of land-based services that are engaged in other activity. We found a number of locations where services have been integrated, at least from the scheduling basis, that the ferry and the transit operators align their schedules so that passengers may transfer between modes when everything goes well. That is, when the weather or traffic reliability issues don't interfere with the capability of people to transfer between water and land. The other thing that we find that makes this sometimes somewhat challenging is that oftentimes a transit route is a multiple purpose transit route. That is that a ferry dock is just simply one stop along the way of a transit route, that it doesn't justify or warrant singular attention in terms of establishing a transit route. So that transit route serves a variety of activities. So in that particular case, the transit operator may feel that they have to adhere to their schedules to avoid inconveniencing passengers who really have no relationship to the ferry at all. They're moving from one activity center to another activity center on the same route that happens to service the ferry, but the ferry, again, is not the central point of contact. Finally, there's operational integration. And this is where you not only have integration of the schedules themselves, but you actually have ferries and land-based transit coordinating operations in real time. We found this in about 30% of the cases in the survey that we did. This is very frequently used where there's very infrequent bus and ferry service, and so it makes the connection much more important. We also found a few instances where this only happens on the first to the last trip of the day, and the general purpose is to avoid stranding people, to make sure that they are able to continue their trip. We find that the highest level of operational integration that was reported in the survey exists where there are ferries that are served by dedicated land transit, and that would be similar to, say, a commuter rail operation where there are buses that are dedicated to a singular commuter rail terminal where the vehicles wait for the trains to arrive, people get off, get on the buses, and they're taken on their way. And in the reverse direction, buses or trains arrive, drop people off specifically to get on the ferry, and they go on. That's where we tend to find the highest level of integration, and that's frequently between the same agency or company, by the way. Moving on then from service coordination to fare coordination, we found about 40% of the interfaces in the survey have some form of fare integration. Either they have an integrated fare structure where a person can pay one fare and be transported both on land and on sea, We find cases of combined fare media. The smart cards are making that much easier to do now in many regions in the U.S. And once in a while we find a few places where there are transfer discounts. So if a person is going to use both land and water-based systems, they may get a 20% discount on the combined fare between the two. Facilities integration, moving off of fares then. We found a number of cases where there is co-location of facilities. A very significant factor in whether or not this can be done is simply the distance a passenger has to travel between the modes, and whether people consider the facility integrated or not. We found that by self-definition, at least, that an integrated facility would be considered a walk distance of average of around 300 feet. Now this varied, by the way, from distances less than 100 feet to distances close to 1,000 feet. And again, it was self-defined. It's not something that we tried to define in the survey itself. But when asked if the ferry or the land-based service was serving an integrated facility, these are the kinds of responses that we received. Oftentimes, one of the challenges with ferries is the shoreline itself. Sometimes in order to attain the connection between land and water, it's necessary to cover some long distance of land or some fairly long distance of shallow water before you can get to a place where a ferry can actually land. And we found that oftentimes in the most integrated facilities, those distances are built to be pleasant and an amenity to direct passengers from one mode to another. The picture that's on the screen right now is in Port Orchard, Washington. This is a facility that belongs to Kitsap Transit. This was built with Federal Transit Administration funds, by the way, this particular facility. And right behind this red gate that the gentleman is standing at is the downtown Port Orchard Transit Center. So they are literally, it's 10 feet from where the gentleman is standing, 20 feet from where the gentleman is standing to where the buses congregate and wait for the ferries. This happens to be a case of a very integrated system, by the way, very well coordinated from the land to the water side. Another important element of facilities integration is signing, where we have large volumes of people coming through, not all of which are headed for the same land-based mode, or we have multiple land-based modes coming into multiple ferry departures. Some of these pictures are from Hoboken, New Jersey, where there's actually signage that will tell people what time the boats are leaving from a particular slip and where they're going to. We have the Bainbridge Island Ferry Terminal here, which is part of the Washington State Ferries network, where they're processing multiple thousands of people on each sailing coming in, and not all of them are headed for the ferries. This happens to also be in Kitsap Transit's territory, where Kitsap Transit typically has up to 18 buses waiting for each ferry arrival in the PM peak, or arriving to drop passengers off for ferry departures in the AM peak. Finally, there's passenger information that we uncovered in a number of cases. In almost all cases, there are paper schedules that are printed. Oftentimes, the paper schedule of the land base or the paper schedule of the water base will refer to the other. The best in current practice that we found, at least, are websites that are compatible with mobile phones, so that as people move from one place to another, they're able to know what's going on. And in some cases, there's even real-time information available to people who are moving from one mode to another about what's going on in their particular mode. So we're almost coming to the landing here. Some lessons learned from this research. The appropriate level of water to land-based transit service really varies based on the geography, the land use, and the travel markets. Operational coordination, that is where if the ferry is late, the buses wait. If the buses are late, the ferries wait, is very heavily linked to the frequency of the ferry or the transit service. The more frequent it is, the less likely it is that there is operational coordination. A strong market for ferries, that is a lot of passengers, is not necessarily an indication of the presence of integrated land-based transit. There are cases where there are very high volumes of people coming in on ferries, and yet there's very little integration with land-based transit. Schedule and real-time information online and optimized for mobile devices allows users to take greater advantage of both land and water-based systems. Water's edge locations for ferry terminals may present real obstacles to integrated facilities. This is particularly true when you're away from or when you're near places where there's a lot of shallow water, and it has to do with the distances that are being covered. And finally, wayfinding systems are a very critical element of successful land and water-based interface. If a person gets off a ferry and does not know where to go, the chances are slim that they're going to be looking for land-based public transit. On the other hand, there's good signing that tells them where the vehicles are that they want to get on and what they need to do to get there. The chances are much better that they will actually engage in moving between land and water base. For further research, some suggestions that we came up with, certainly a guidebook for development of capital and operational agreements between land and water-based systems would be helpful. TRB recently published a guidebook, an economic guidebook for establishing ferry systems, and we see this as something that could be supplemental to that effort. More research is really needed on some of the basic determinants for assessing the potential of untapped ferry rider markets, and this is a project I'm currently working on in the Washington, D.C. area, trying to get a handle on what are potential markets, and there's some interesting points there that we continue to probe and need further research because they'll have applications in many other parts of the country. A couple of points I want to talk about there are the degree to which mode familiarity attracts market. In the Washington, D.C. area, it's really interesting that very few people even think of a ferry as a mode of transportation. It is out of the lexicon of people in Washington, D.C. And one of the interesting factors is how much does that influence people's choice about whether a ferry would make a reasonable transportation option for them as opposed to choosing a different mode. Noel referred to some of the ability of ferries to either compete or supplement or complement land-based transit where there are parallel routes or a high degree of congestion. This is something that we've really taken a very hard look at in the I-95 corridor from Northern Virginia into Washington, D.C. I would say that I don't know that we still have the answer. There are many deep-seated behavioral travel issues that need further research for us to really understand how people make choices and what are those primary determining factors that may attract them to a ferry, even though it might be more expensive, even though the travel time would give them no advantage, why they would choose to use a ferry over a different mode. And that's a particular piece of research that really needs to be looked at further. And I pretty much, at the end, I'm just going to put this up. There's many more potential research topics that are available to look at in detail. There is my contact information, and I'm going to roll it over to the next person now.
Okay, hello. My name is Hannah Henn, and I'm here representing the New York City Economic Development Corporation. I'm going to be speaking a bit more specifically about the New York City region today, and hopefully we'll provide some examples that can build more specifically off of the issues that Noel and Tim have been referencing. So New York has had a recent resurgence in ferries. As you can see in this photo, there's a lot of boat activity in the New York Harbor. And so I'm just going to give you some background about the regional ferry system and some of our recent ferry initiatives. And then our East River Ferry pilot is our largest scale new ferry project that we've had in the past few years. And I'll share some of the lessons learned from that project. And then talk a little bit about what New York is thinking about in terms of moving forward and building off of all of this information we've gathered recently from our pilot project initiative. So just for some background, New York is a city of islands. We have over 500 miles of shoreline here in New York. So the water has always been a very important mode for transportation. Historically, people would come in on trains, and in order to get to Manhattan, would take ferries across the water. There was major industry on the water, but as bridges and tunnels came into being, ferry service really declined in New York. So by the 1980s, the only major ferry service in New York was the Staten Island Ferry. The Staten Island Ferry remains totally publicly operated and serves about 70,000 passengers per day. In the 1980s, there was a resurgence of private ferry operations in New York. So you can see on this regional map here that there are a lot of routes connecting Manhattan to New Jersey. And the Manhattan to New Jersey services really arose as a way of filling transit gaps, and there were a lot of time savings associated with the ferry services provided here. These ferries compete with very congested modes, either the existing tunnels under the Hudson, or else the pass train, which is very congested. So it's a more comfortable ride, and opening up ferry service really opened up the this area of New Jersey, opened it up to development along the waterfront. So there's a lot of residential density that grew in parallel with the ferry services. So you can see there are just a couple of routes shown on this map that are services within New York only. The brown route over on the East River on the east side of Manhattan is the East River Ferry. That is a pilot program that was started in the summer of 2011, and we are now nearing the end of our 3-year pilot program. And you can also see from southern Manhattan to Brooklyn, there is a service that IKEA operates between Manhattan and Red Hook. So there is the New Jersey pattern is strong and really established, and although those services technically are not subsidized in terms of operations, they are essentially subsidized because all of the infrastructure that they're using most of the infrastructure that they're using is supported by New Jersey Department of Transportation, by the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey. There's a lot of federal funding that's gone in to support the infrastructure that these operators rely on. The East River Ferry is a new model for New York City in that we are subsidizing a service that is operated by a private operator. So it's a new type of partnership, and this is where my organization, the Economic Development Corporation, came into play. It's a new model that has actually turned out to be very, very successful. So the East River Ferry has by far exceeded any of the anticipated ridership levels, and last year we had over 1.2 million riders, and our subsidy per rider is now at about the same rate as the subsidy for the local buses here in New York, which is, we're really proud to have hit that benchmark. So here you see a picture of the East River Ferry, and I'm going to speak about some of the benefits. direct user benefits, we've done a lot of rider surveys, trying to, not only on the East River Ferry, but also on our Rockaway Ferry service. And last summer we had a pilot where we expanded IKEA's Red Hook summer service. The city contributed to expand that service. So we've gathered a lot of information from the people who ride the ferries. And the top reason for riding is the quality of the experience. So especially for commuters, when you're comparing this to a very crowded subway train, you're almost always going to get a seat on a ferry. You have a great view. As Noelle mentioned, you're not stuck in this gridlock traffic, and it's just really reduces stress levels for commuters. So that's the top reason that people want to ride the ferry. Reliability is very important. So with the East River Ferry, we have a pretty high frequency of service. The ferries come during rush hour every 20 minutes, and maintaining that headway and reliability has been very important to our success. There are some time savings associated with the ferry, not for every route. So some routes have better time savings than others, but where you have the time savings, that's a great benefit. And accessibility. Here in New York with our other transit modes, a lot of the neighborhoods that the East River Ferry is serving have old subway stations that are not ADA compliant. So we are able to provide an alternative accessible mode in these neighborhoods where the only other accessible transit option is bus. So it's an alternative mode that has better accessibility. Some benefits to our transportation network. Again, a lot of this relates to the subway. Starting a new ferry system is, although it is by no means easy and does require a lot of investment and time, it is significantly less intensive than starting a new subway. So we've done comparisons with subway expansion for similar purposes to expand transit access to developing neighborhoods. And for the East River Ferry, it cost us $8 million per mile served in terms of capital investment, whereas for the 7-train extension to Hudson Yards, approximately $1.6 billion was spent per mile served. So the subway can certainly address larger passenger volumes, and the ferry really can't compete with the volume of the subway, but in terms of opening up access to neighborhoods, especially in waterfront neighborhoods that have been recently rezoned, where we want to encourage development, ferries are a really flexible, faster way to open up those neighborhoods to development. There is some load shedding from subways to ferries. Really, the load shedding is more significant on the Hudson River route, so the PATH train experiences a lot of load shedding benefits from the ferries. But we've also shown that the East River Ferry has had some load shedding impacts in lower Manhattan. And then with the growth of bicycling in New York, the ferry is a great partner for the cycling initiative. So we accept bicycles on the boat. There are limitations to how many bikes we can have on board, but now that we have bike share, we see a lot of opportunity for expanding our catchment area. Over about 80% of our riders on the East River Ferry walk to and from their ferry landings, so density around the ferry landings is very important to our ridership pattern. But we really see a lot of opportunity with bike share, and we're currently collecting data. We did some surveys last summer, and we're going to do additional surveying this spring to see how we can partner with bike share to really serve a broader population. So development benefits, I have already touched on the fact that ferries really open up access to these neighborhoods. I just want to mention that for the first time we have quantitative information on the impacts of the East River Ferry on the Brooklyn and Queens waterfront. So we recently worked with a consultant based out of Philadelphia, eConsult, and they did a complete analysis of the impacts of the East River Ferry, and the values that you see here are all attributed solely to the ferry. So as I mentioned, our riders walk to and from the ferry, so it makes sense that the biggest property value increases are within 1/8 of a mile of the ferry landing. And we have a lot of density around those landings, so that 8% adds up to a really large impact. So in total, East River Ferry, we attribute $500 million of increased residential property value to the ferry. And it's only been running for almost 3 years, so we're really happy with that performance. Another important benefit in terms of keeping costs down is that if we can come up with routes that really attract recreational riders as well as commuters, every recreational rider that we get on board lowers the overall cost per passenger and really supports the service that we're trying to provide for commuters. I won't get into too many details here, but New York has had a lot of experiences where ferries have truly saved the day. So our most recent experience where ferries have played a key role was after Hurricane Sandy. You see a picture here of the Rockaways, which is a peninsula on the outer edges of Queens, and the A train is the primary mode of transit to the Rockaways, and the A train was washed out, the tracks were washed out during Sandy, so this temporary ferry landing in this photo was put in place just 2 days after the storm, and we have been running service actually ever since Sandy. So even when the A train came back up, you know, community outcry to continue the service was so strong that we have continued service, and ridership has continued to grow. This ferry service is now serving a second location in Brooklyn in a neighborhood where a subway tunnel has been closed for repairs because of Sandy damage. This subway tunnel is closed for about 14 months. So while the subway tunnel is out of commission, we're also connecting the ferry to that location in Sunset Park in Brooklyn. And just an example of how flexible they are, how quickly you can get service back up and running. And you know, if we have the equipment, if we have the infrastructure, it's very possible to set up a service quickly and fill transit gaps. So here are two of our recent publications. We have our Citywide Ferry Study, our preliminary report, and a white paper on our ferry policies here in New York. Both of these were published in December, and the links are provided here, and I would encourage you to take a look. The Citywide Ferry Study looked at 58 sites across the 5 boroughs and developed a very complex ridership prediction model and demand model, and proposes what we see as the 6 strongest routes for ferry expansion in the future in New York. Some other key challenges identified in the ferry study are shown here. Our most recent successful programs have been our ferry pilots, but there is a challenge in starting pilot programs because we are looking to do a program for 1 summer or 3 years or 2 years, and we work with private operators in the harbor who are investing in multi-million-dollar boats. So there's a mismatch between our desire to try out short programs and the needs of the operators to invest in the boats needed to run those programs. That's a major challenge. Operating funding is always a very important challenge. And then trying to optimize the ridership while minimizing costs. Over 50% of our costs are fuel-driven, so the length of the routes really have an impact on the cost associated with providing ferry service. What I think is our most interesting finding from our Citywide Ferry Study is that the demand for ferry service within New York is very different from the demand between New York and New Jersey. So we had stated preference survey data that we were able to use to show that our ferries within New York are really competing with the costs associated with subways and buses. So there is great demand for ferries if the price is similar to that of the subway. And we found that for some of the routes that we were designing, we would actually end up with far more revenue if we charged less, because we could tap into so many more passengers if we reduced the fare. So that's something we're really considering moving forward, and will be interesting to see if you know, the models are correct. So now that we have all of this great information from the ferry study, now that we have our lessons learned from the East River Ferry, we're trying to explore new financial tools for expansion. The great thing about ferries is so flexible and you can start them up quickly. But there's also, in terms of encouraging investment around ferries, they are so flexible that you really want to instill some confidence in investors around ferry landings that a service is going to continue. So we're looking at some creative tools to continue to fund those and create investor confidence. Here you see a couple of maps from our citywide ferry study showing some potential new routes, some of the stronger routes that we found. Just looking ahead, we know that there's great demand for a ferry service in New York, and you know, working for the city, we hear from different communities all the time who really want us to bring ferries to different places all across the city. We know from the East River Ferry that it really has enhanced the waterfront and that there's great opportunity for increasing property value in these neighborhoods. But we have a lot of room for improvement with integration with other transit modes. We continue to work with the MTA, considering some sort of fare integration with the MetroCard. We are expanding the use of using phone apps for online ticket purchases, which has been very successful, but there's a lot of room for improvement, and City Bike is another area where we really hope to dig in. And then we're working on getting out our final report for our citywide ferry study. That will be out this spring, and there'll be a lot of additional information in that final report. And yeah, the next step is funding. So we need to fund all of these great initiatives, and we're really excited about the opportunities we have once we work out these tricky funding tools. Hopefully we'll have some great new routes that we can share with you in the future. And that's all I have. Thank you.
Great, thanks everybody. So we can open it up now for a few minutes to some questions. So feel free to use that chat box to ask any questions that you have. We do have some logged already. The first one is specifically for Noelle. Noelle, can you briefly, can you elaborate on the security and operational constraints of ferry service in a highly militarized marine environment such as Hampton Roads, Virginia?
It's hard to comment on that because, can y'all hear me? I assume everybody can hear me.
Yep, we can hear you.
Thank you, just to clarify. It's hard to comment on that because it's currently under study. VDOT provided funds before Sean Connaughton left office relative to looking at that issue, notably out of the naval facility across the harbor. It is also an issue that Tim Payne, and I apologize earlier, I think I said Tim Jackson, but that Tim Payne has been addressing here with some of the military installations because that's considered part of the market. The mere point is that for those of you who are federal employees in military organizations, you're familiar with CAT cards and secured and controlled access. So having been in the world of DoD and the Navy, it becomes an issue of allowing access to the military personnel, but as we all know, more importantly, the civilian personnel who don't necessarily have access to that facility. That is currently being explored here. In most cases, the location of the terminal itself won't be directly within the facility. It would have to be at a site that shares a location with the facility, if you will, on the waterfront, or is along the perimeter, such as has access both ways. Navy has been kind of moving towards using technology instead of personnel to save money in terms of its manpower requirements, in terms of its security requirements, and that's all according to its policy. So there's a couple of issues going on, but part of that, and then the last example would be that Fairfax Connector, I believe it is, if it's not Metrobus, is running a service out of Franconia to Fort Belvoir. Civilians who are on that particular bus are given a warning a couple stops in advance and then reminded they have to exit the bus before it enters the base. So it's really meant to be a joint use bus, which is great, but you do, if you will, have conflicts. So it's a matter of separating the civilian versus military personnel. I hope that kind of answered your question.
Great, thanks. The next question, are there any, and this is for any of you, are there any active projects for developing commuter ferries on the Potomac River that is beyond the study phase?
I'll take that. The current study that's being finalized right now is essentially a market assessment, and that has blossomed a lot of interest in establishing commuter ferries on the Potomac River. I would say there are some promising developments there. I think the difficulty on the Potomac is establishing and securing landing sites. It's been close to 100 years since there were ferries operating on the Potomac, and much of the waterfront has developed, not including water transportation as part of their modern heritage, if you will, and getting the idea that a ferry could be a valuable part of the transportation infrastructure without injuring some other value that a community holds to their waterfront is turning out to be a little challenging. There are also many cases where there just are no facilities developed at all. There are just simply no places suitable for passenger facilities, even though the demand for ferries is relatively high. There simply isn't a place to land a ferry. So there are a couple of challenges really standing in the way of getting commuter ferries operating on the Potomac River. And those are a couple of them. But there is definitely activity. I wouldn't say that there's anything where someone's going to come out next month and announce that there's going to be a commuter ferry operating between point A and point B on the Potomac. I don't think that's likely. But I would say that within the next couple of years, maybe, it is possible that there might be an announcement that there is a ferry service, commuter ferry service, that is. I want to emphasize there already is ferry service operating on the Potomac that is intended for more casual use. In the summer months in particular, the demand for that ferry is relatively high. Noel showed you a picture of National Harbor. There's and a picture of the ferry that runs between Alexandria and National Harbor. On a busy summer day, they'll run 700 to 800 passengers per day on that particular service, and that's without commuters because they're not operating during times when commuters would be traveling. So there is great potential on the river, and that continues to be in development.
Great. Okay. Next question. Do the existing travel demand models include ferries as a mode choice?
In some cases, they do. This is Tim. In some cases, travel demand models do include ferries as a mode choice. And in other cases, they do not. In the Puget Sound region, for instance, the Puget Sound Regional Council travel demand model does include ferries as a mode choice. But in the Metropolitan Washington Council of Governments model, ferries are not included as a mode choice because there aren't any right now, so they have not included that as a potential mode choice. I'll let Hannah talk about New York. I just point out that she mentioned that in the citywide ferry study, one of the things they did was develop a specific travel demand model for ferries. And Hannah, maybe you can say a little bit more about that.
Yes, so that model was developed by our consultant, Steer Davies-Gleave, and I'm by no means a modeling expert, but we were able to calibrate, so it was very specific, and we were able to calibrate that model using real ridership data that we have from the East River Ferry and other ferry services. So we used our real ridership data, and then the tool to really determine what the actual elasticity of demand was in terms of ferries came from the stated preference survey that was performed by the Port Authority. And I believe that was performed within the past few years, perhaps in 2010. I'm not sure of the exact date, but they surveyed New York residents in the 5 boroughs specifically about ferries. And those who were surveyed were captured at different transit, major transit areas in the city, so getting off of express buses at major subway stations, and that's really what we relied on to build our New York-specific model for ferries.
Okay, great. Thank you. Next question. This one's pretty good. How much does weather affect this mode versus other modes of travel? It's an interesting question.
That is an interesting question, and that's actually one of the questions for further research that we identified. Is what is the interaction of weather or traffic on the ability to integrate land and water-based transportation? I can tell you from my experiences here in the Puget Sound region, you might think that it has a lot more effect than it actually does. In the central part of the basin, the reliability of the ferry service completion rate is very, very high. On-time performance is more often related to issues that are around mechanical or traffic loading issues than they are weather issues by far. But that will vary depending on the location and the particular type of ferry that's being created.
All right. Go ahead.
A little bit to that. Oh, was that question about demand or performance or unspecified?
I believe it was unspecified.
Okay, so I would just say that in our rider surveys that the strongest piece of feedback that we get from riders is that they want better shelters at the ferry landings, and that's something that we really struggle with here in New York because there's a lot of attention paid to keeping the waterfront unobstructed. There's a lot of public space along the waterfront, and so if you think about it, standing out for a ferry on a windy, wet winter day can be very uncomfortable. So shelters are really important, we believe, in maintaining ridership. And one of
I'm sorry, hold on. Let me just...
I really want to dig into.
I just wanted to interrupt real quick. Noelle is actually mobile right now. Noelle, if it's possible that you can try to mute yourself, we can hear you.
Yeah, hang on 1 second.
I'm sorry.
Go
ahead, thanks.
So although we have similar shelters in most of our New York stops, there are some interesting New Jersey routes that have enclosed buildings and others that have more standard shelters. So I would really like to look at how their ridership patterns change and whether the drops in ridership during the winter are lower. But I will say on the East River Ferry, although our weekend ridership drops off significantly, as basically starting around November, December, our ridership drops significantly. Our weekday ridership stays pretty steady. It does decline, but in the summer we're getting about 3,000 to 4,000 daily commuters, and in the winter it hovers around 2,000 to 3,000. So they decline, but not to an extreme level. Just so.
Great, thanks. Next question is sort of like a chicken and egg kind of question. So what needs to come first, considering ferry routes stops near well-developed mixed-use areas, or planning ferry interfaces and then hoping for future development?
Well, I'll just point out something that Hannah said that is pretty universal truth. Her reference was only to New York, but most successful ferry operations, whether they're publicly or privately funded, have depended on a substantial amount of public investment to establish shoreside facilities. And public investment tends only to react to known factors and not gambling on what may occur in the future. So I would say, given that, the probability is very high that development of a ferry service is far more likely to be focused on existing and rapidly growing areas that are developed close to waterfronts rather than presupposing that that could happen and building a ferry facility and a ferry to attract new development. A lot of that has gone on in the San Francisco Bay Area as well, and oftentimes the developer or the public authority will establish the feasibility of ferries, but the actual operation won't occur until there's some level of development that supports at least some amount of ridership on the ferry.
Okay. Last question. What are some of the most successful ways to limit or minimize shoreline impacts due to wakes? What restrictions are allowed to be established per federal law?
Noel may want to jump in here too, but there are currently no specific federal laws other than saying that vessel operators are responsible for the whatever damage can be associated with the operation of their vessel. So if I knowingly go through a very narrow channel at a very high rate of speed with a vessel that creates a lot of wave energy, and it can be shown that there is a relationship between that wave energy and damage done to private property, under federal law at least, there's no established penalties or anything like that, but there is a responsibility linkage established for that. So we'll just start there. There is some case law on the books about establishing the relationship between creating wave energy and shoreline erosion, some of it here in the Puget Sound region. And there's also been research done now on how to best attenuate that ability. Kitsap Transit recently finished a pilot on a low wave propagation, high-speed passenger-only vessel in a fairly restricted waterway between Seattle and Bremerton that I would say I would characterize the results as being very positive in terms of being able to create a vessel that can move at a high rate of speed and still propagate low wave energy. There's also several wave attenuation devices on the market now that show great promise. The difficulty with those, of course, is that they effectively block the shoreline. So they really only have applications in places where keeping a completely open shoreline in all cases is not a requirement, or where a fairly narrow channel could be established for operation of a vessel that produces a lot of wave energy, while the rest of the waterway is reserved for vessels that don't, like human-powered vessels that don't create a lot of wave energy. So those are a couple of possibilities out there, but those are some of the more critical issues that are starting to arise as ferries are being looked at for operating in more constrained waterways.
I would just add to that in our citywide ferry study, in the final report that's coming out, we have an entire section on wakes and surge as it relates to ferries. So for further information, I would recommend taking a look at the report later this spring. One additional issue that we are taking a look at here in New York is, in addition to the wake being produced by the ferries, there are operating challenges with our ferries being in close proximity to shipping channels and the major surge created by the commercial vessels in the shipping channels. And as we expand ferry service, there are some locations where our ferries could face challenges in trying to safely load and unload passengers in proximity to those vessels in the surge. So that's another issue we're taking a look at.
Great. Thank you. All right, well, I think that pretty much wraps this up for this afternoon. So thank you to Noelle if you're still hanging around, and to Tim and Hannah for joining us today, and thank you to the Transportation Planning Division for sponsoring this. And just as a reminder to log the CM credits, you can see the event number on the screen now. And also, if you're having any trouble logging your CMs, you can always search directly by your event number, or you can search through the Ohio chapter. The Ohio chapter is the chapter that houses the CM credits for us. So you can search either of those ways, and if you have any trouble, you can always email us. So thanks again to our speakers, and everyone enjoy the rest of your Friday and your weekend, and we'll see you next time. Thanks, everybody.